In this video, I'd like to talk to you about a long-run theory of inflation, or how inflation occurs over a long period of time. And in this video, we're going to talk about the quantity theory of money. Before we get to the theory, I'd like to introduce you to the equation of exchange, sometimes called the quantity equation. M stands for money supply, or the quantity of money. We know how many dollars have been created, we know how many are in circulation, and we know the value of checking and savings accounts at banks. Let's skip velocity and move on to this part of the equation right here. P stands for price level. We are going to measure the price level as the real GDP deflator divided by 100. And Y stands for real GDP. Now let's take P times Y, and what we end up with is nominal GDP. And nominal GDP is equivalent to all expenditures in the economy. So let's go back to this velocity right here. And what velocity is the number of times each dollar or unit of currency is spent, and usually in a year. So if we take the quantity of money that we know we have in the economy, the number of times each dollar is spent in a year, we multiply those two things together, what we should find is total expenditures. And that's what the quantity equation is telling us. This is an identity. This is always the case. It's true by construction. Now let's transform our equation of exchange, or our quantity equation, into growth rates. So percentage change in the money supply, or growth in the money supply, plus growth in velocity is going to be approximately equal to growth in price level. Growth in price level is inflation, and macroeconomists like to use the symbol pi to denote inflation. The inflation rate plus the growth rate in real GDP. So we can rewrite what we have here into this equation here. The inflation rate is approximately equal to the growth rate in money plus the growth rate in velocity less the growth rate in real GDP. Again, this is an identity. This is true by construction. It's like saying 2 plus 2 is 4. Now, in order to turn this identity into a theory, we need to make some assumptions. And we are going to assume that velocity is constant. We're not going to say what it is. It just doesn't change over a long period of time. If velocity is constant, that means that the average growth rate of velocity is going to be equal to a 0. So that's one assumption. The next assumption is that real GDP is not determined by money or price level. So real GDP, this Y, is determined by maybe level of technology, size of population, the amount of capital stock, but these are things that don't have anything to do with the quantity of money or price level. This is a long-run theory. These assumptions are pretty good over a long period of time, but may not hold over a short period of time. But if these assumptions are good, then the inflation rate is the difference between the money growth rate and the growth rate of output. Now let's take a look. What I have for you is growth and velocity. So this is our percent change in velocity. And I have this plotted from 1960 to 2020. And if you take a look at this, you're going to notice that it looks like something like a random number generator, but it has an average of something close to 0. So over this whole time period, the average growth rate of velocity isn't exactly, but is pretty close to 0. And if we were to pick a subset of this series, if it's enough years, we're going to get something pretty close to 0. Now, what about real GDP growth? Again, this is a volatile series, but it doesn't have a trend, suggesting that there's some average that is fairly stable over time. From what I've shown you, you should take that as evidence that over a long enough period of time, our quantity theory of money does a fairly good job in explaining the inflation rate. So the inflation rate is approximately equal to the difference between the growth rate in the money supply and growth rate in real GDP. So if the central bank increases the growth rate of money supply, that's not going to change the growth rate of real GDP, and it's going to have a proportional effect on inflation. Well, I hope this video is helpful in explaining where inflation comes from over long periods of time. Inflation comes from growth in money.